I'm Carla Kemble. I work with Alberta Health Services in the provincial addiction and mental health portfolio with our promotion, prevention, and community initiatives. And I work on the mental health promotion and illness prevention team. I've also included my email because we're on such a tight schedule. You might have questions that I won't have time to answer today. So please ask you to go ahead and fire me an email if you have anything else you're wondering about. If I can't answer it, I'll make sure to find someone who can. I'm excited to be here for a number of reasons. I'm an academic nerd and I love being on campus, so there's that. I'm really excited to be teaching and not having to mark anything, nor having to give you the pain of an assignment, so that's a win-win. And I'm excited because this is now a part of your curriculum. So you are our first test subjects with this particular curriculum, so I appreciate any feedback you want to give along the way, because we want it to be useful, relevant, meaningful, and hopefully igniting to help you take these things forward. Okay? We're going to start by just talking a little bit about our learning goals. We're just going to be looking at mental health stigma, what that means, how it impacts people, how do we start to address that through mental health literacy, looking at developmental frameworks on mental health and mental illness, and then what is the role of the teacher, both in terms of when you're interfacing with people who are identifying or being diagnosed with mental illness, but also what is your role in promoting mental well-being and mental health. And those are different concepts, and hopefully you'll be able to sort of understand and take forth that difference into your teaching after today. Okay. It's going to be a simple word association sort of activity we're doing here. So when I tell you what to write, you're not going to get a lot of time to write it. It's just the first two words that come off the top of your head. It's anonymous. There is no judgment. I don't want you to judge what you're writing. I don't want you to censor yourself. I just want you to write what comes up first for you, because it's part of telling where we sit with some of these things and how we frame things and all the wonderful things we're going to learn and unlearn. Okay? So on the number one sheet that you've written number one on, I also want you to now write illness/disorder. And then I want you to write the first two words that come to mind when you think of the terms illness or disorder. Put your number two on your sheet, and now I want you to write the word teacher. And I want you to give me the first two words that come to mind when you think of teacher. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back to our first page and talk about illness disorder. And we're going to ask you guys to categorize. I'm going to read out some of the things that people wrote down, and I want you to categorize. Is it a positive thing? Is it a neutral concept? Or is it negative? Okay? So if we go to illness or disorder, unhealthy, where would you put that? ADHD and depression. So we heard a neutral, sad, and challenges. Negative, okay. We have stigma. Where would you put that one? Negative, okay. Sick or bad? Negative, okay. Handicapped. Neutral, okay. So you see sort of a thing developing. Do we have it? How many positives do we have there? When we think of illness or disorder, framing things in that way often conjures negative stereotypes, negative connotations, right? So let's go to teacher. What did you guys write down for teacher, if I can find it here? Guide, Yoda. Star Wars fans. Where'd you put those? Positive, okay. Caring. Busy. Neutral. And then did I hear negative as well? Negative, okay, so we'll put it in both. Instructor. Neutral. Okay, we got caring again. Y'all get that a lot. Approachable. Kind. And lifelong learning. So we're going to leave it at that because we could go on all day. Thank you very much. How many do we have in the negative here? We have one, right? So obviously you kind of can get the gist of what we're getting at here is that fundamentally, when we think about illness or disorder, we think about a lot of the negative factors involved in that. But when we think about teacher or any other descriptor in life, are you guys teachers 24 hours a day necessarily? Do you operate in that role 24 hours a day? Do people with an illness disorder necessarily operate in that space every hour of the day? They might not, right? It's a piece of their experience. It's not the totality of who they are, but yet we oftentimes see it as something that's going to be all-consuming. And it doesn't mean that it isn't at times. It's not to belittle the struggles that people face when they're struggling with particularly a mental illness or disorder. But it's when we use that language that it can become stigmatizing. And in the context of mental health, we're talking about negative labels to identify a person living with mental illness. So what are some of the negative labels people get if they're living with mental illness? What would be some of the negative words people use? Crazy. What else? Unstable. When I was in school, we used the term schizo, psycho, all of these things. If you're actually looking at the diagnosis they're referring to, not at all what we're using to describe it. Do we think it's okay when kids say, oh, that's so gay now, to insult something? No, we don't. So we really are starting to ask people to think about languaging, thinking about the perspectives we take when we think about what people might be living with in their life. Because what it does is that lack of understanding and oftentimes the negative perspectives that come with it and those stereotypes often keeps mental illness in the closet. And most people, many people will say that stigma is worse than living with the disorder itself or the illness itself, right? Because they are constantly negotiating how people are seeing them, whether they're going to interact with them or how they're going to interact with them, or if they'll even acknowledge them at all, right? I think about, I've worked 21 years as a social worker. I have my master's in social work, so I've done a lot of clinical practice, as well as always had an element of community practice. And in my latter years, I've done a lot more prevention, promotion, and now I'm solely in the promotion realm. And I can say that working with people who are homeless and struggling with mental illness, one of the biggest pieces they said, one of the most emotionally and psychologically harmful things for them on a day-to-day basis was being treated like they didn't exist as a human being, that nobody looked at them, nobody said hi, nobody smiled. Now, that's not to say there aren't times where we are negotiating where we're at in a situation, right? But to think about saying hello, if someone asks you for money, simply saying, hi there, no, I'm sorry, I don't have any to give you today. Have an awesome day. Carrying on makes a difference than just walking by and not looking at someone, right? So, and it also makes people go inward if they are struggling. They aren't necessarily going to talk about it freely because of how the risks of how they will be perceived. So underlying that is often disrespect, and it's not always intentional. It's about cultural, the permissions or the privileges we have that we don't think about that lead us to talk about things in ways that we aren't thinking about because we don't have to think about it. So thinking about the privileges that we all walk around, that we all have different privileges we walk with. And it doesn't mean that you're intentionally disrespecting, but the effect is that it's disrespectful or discriminatory. It keeps people living with mental illness often in one-down positions, right? Part of what we can do is listen to what people are saying about their experience with mental illness. And that also means not just listening for what the struggle must be and the pain and what do I need to show compassion for. It's like listening to who they are as people and the fact that actually many people are mitigating and living with mental illness with great success, while also sometimes having to attend to it at different points in time, right? It looks different for everybody. Thinking about the language you use and role modeling that, right? Not just in terms of how we talk, but also maybe how do we, with gentleness, with curiosity, with respect, challenge the people around us to operate and respond differently. We want to monitor media and respond to stigmatizing material. I was talking about the fact that I've gone in this work that I've done, and now especially in the last probably 10 years of my career, I've been more steeped in mental health and mental health promotion, and went back and watched, you know, when you rewatch a movie and you're like, oh, I don't remember that part, I don't remember it like that, because your knowledge is in a different place. Does anybody here seen As Good as It Gets with Helen Hunt and Jack Nicholson? She speaks, he's displaying what one would think was obsessive compulsive disorder. And very cute, and he's medicated, he's taking medications, and it affects his ability to relate to people socially. She speaks to him in cruel ways. She calls him crazy. Can you just be normal? And it doesn't mean that there isn't relational conversations that might happen around those things, but she is cruel and she's stigmatizing. And I go back and I'm like, I thought it was funny the first time I watched it, but the second time I'm like, that's not funny at all. Actually, it's really kind of sad, right? So just looking at when kids are interfacing, now that's an old movie, but Kids are interfacing with all sorts of information all the time. So we have lots of beautiful opportunities to help them be critical thinkers and to help us be critical thinkers about what we're seeing in the world and what's being communicated and how we're communicating back, right? So this is one of the links you can go to. There's some videos, people talking about living with a mental illness, both the challenges as well as the successes and the joys and the day-to-day living. Okay. I think what's really important is also we don't often hear, like we're more likely to hear the sensationalized version of things. For instance, several years ago when a man struggling with psychosis decapitated a man on the bus. That's what we hear about, but what we don't hear in the news regularly is that actually people, particularly youth, who are living with mental illness are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators of violence. They're often way more vulnerable to violence, and I can certainly say that about the people I've worked with who are dealing often with chronic mental illness. They were far more likely to have repetitive experiences of violence, not because they were perpetrating, but because people were targeting them, right? And I think the thing that we need to be really aware of is by age 40, almost 50% of us will have or have had or will have had a mental illness at some point. That's half the population. And so I think flipping the script to say it's not about them and how we show compassion for them, it's about how do we be healthier and flourish as a whole, right? And instead of trying to sort of pinpoint mental illness as something specific. That doesn't mean we don't attend to it. It doesn't mean we don't need early identification and best evidence treatments, because that's going to help people flourish with mental illness. And we're going to talk about that a bit later. So this is just to show that there's a lot of semantic confusion on the types of terms and concepts we use to describe mental health and mental illness. Even in the literature, there's overlap. Some people are talking about the same concepts using different terminology. So for the sake of clarity, we just want to talk a little bit about what this looks like. Okay, so this is a pyramid. Please note it's not a continuum. They're states of being and places to exist at any point in time. A good portion of us, and most of the time, people are operating on these bottom two states of being. Most people will either have no distress problem or disorder, or they will be struggling with some sort of mental distress. Mental distress is normal. It's part of daily living. We need it to grow, learn, and develop. So this is why we don't want to take away all the stress the kids experience. We want to help them figure out how to navigate through those things. Because if they don't ever learn that, does life ever stop throwing potentially mentally distressing things at you? Also, what about school? Does everybody just float through school like, oh, it's so much fun, I love exams? No, you don't. Light your pants on fire if you say you do, right? Yeah, exactly. This is my gift. I used to teach post-secondary. I love it. I hate marking. Hate it. That's why I don't do it anymore. But because it was stressful, right? There's a lot of work to do, just like it's stressful for you guys to do assignments. We all experience mental distress, and it comes and it goes. It's a part of our daily life, and it's unavoidable. Mental health problem occurs when our capacity to cope or our tools, etc., are outstripped by a significant event or stressor. So we begin to experience effects of that. So loss, grief and loss, huge. Grief is powerful, it's a beast, and you can't avoid it. It will follow you, you have to go through it to get around and heal from it, right? And it isn't a good example of a mental problem. You have to go through an experience of it because it's profound. Mental illness and disorder is a much smaller portion. We don't actually know all the different reasons why mental illness exists. We know that it's a complex interplay of genetics and environment, and we know that it is shaped within a culture that people are living in and the perspectives around mental illness in that culture. But what we do know, both those factors play an important role, and it may change over generations. How our genes are expressed may change. So you may have a family with history of depression, but in your genes it may only express as you experience periodic sadness, but you don't have all the symptoms that would create a diagnosis of depression. Or you might have nothing. It depends, right? So there's no hard and fast rule about what that looks like. But what we do know with mental disorder and illness is it's a disruption in function. Cognitive function, emotional function, in the ways that we relate to people, how we behave. It's a disruption and a dysregulation. Make sense? You might have a student who is in a number of these places all at the same time. You might have a kid who has been diagnosed with ADHD and has a learning plan around that. He may also have lost his dog and be feeling really sad. And he may be stressing out about the upcoming test in your class, right? So he's on 3 of those layers. So this is when we go back to language, this would be where some of this language belongs, perhaps. Now there's a million other words you could put in there. But when we're talking about depressed, we're actually talking about a diagnosis, right? If you are depressed, then you're looking at a diagnosis versus feeling disappointed or upset or sad. So just use that to help you sort of frame it for yourselves as well. So then what do we do? So what are some of the possibilities in terms of the work that you're doing, right? So when there's no problem, that's where we're really looking at mental health promotion and resilience, things that build resilience. So mental health capacity building projects, things like roots of empathy, right? You get kids learning early how to feel and show and engage with empathy. Mental distress is when we still want to help build resilience because, again, we know it's normal, it's going to happen. So that's where if kids are anxious about tests, how do you help them recognize and manage the anxiety so they can do better with the tests? We might help them avoid further distress. We want to help them build things that will help avoid further development of a problem and help protect them, have protective factors in play. Right? Mental health problems, you're going to be enhancing supports and doing more targeted prevention. So is there any examples of issues in a classroom or in a school where you might have to be targeting the prevention? Anybody think of anything? I know you've all been in schools, or most of you have been now. Was there any trends or things that were happening in the school? For instance, we had, there's a whole bunch of, like a run of kids showing up and they got caught with marijuana and stuff like that. So we did some more dialogue and discourse around cannabis use and sort of what was happening and how people are coping strategies, all those kind of things, right? So that would be targeted prevention. And of course with mental disorder and illness, what's your role as a teacher when you see things that might indicate there might be more need with a child who might be showing signs of a mental disorder or illness? What ends up being your role as a teacher? Your job is really to help connect, right? Because you guys have the gift and the sometimes burden of being right up front with kids when this stuff is happening because you see them so many hours of a day, right? You're going to see when that happens. This is to show that the majority, 70% of all mental disorders show up between the ages of 12 and 25. Right? So right sort of as puberty onset hits, that's when they show up. So I think this is why it's so important. And what's going on with kids? Why do you think that happens at this age? What's going on? What are the factors that might contribute to this onset? There's sensitive periods in our lives for development, for brain development in particular, prenatal, early childhood, and then again during adolescence. And that's when, what we know now is that we used to think, okay, after a certain age, shut down. And like really like after 12 or if sometimes it was 12 and then it moved up to 18, that, oh, no more brain development. But now we know it's actually really, really growing and pruning itself all the way into your mid-20s, right? So a lot of you are still, hooray for you, everything's growing and new, right? And I'm hopeful, because I'm way older than you, that than many of you, that they may discover that the brain is just doing beautiful things later as well, right? To give you a snapshot, this is the prevalence in an average classroom of a range of the most sort of more common disorders, right? Noticing that psychosis and suicide are actually quite rare, but statistics look different depending on the population, right? So in Indigenous communities, because of a huge range of social determinants of health factors relating to conditions, et cetera, and access to care and all those kinds of things, suicide rates are actually higher. But in your average classroom, this is not a specialized classroom. It's not one where there's extra learning supports. It's not a classroom, an alternative type classroom. It's not a classroom where there's kids who are academically advanced. This is your average school classroom. This is what you would see. So that shows you that pyramid up top, that little piece of mental illness is actually relatively small, but yet as we get older, we're quite likely to have experienced some kind of mental illness at some point in our lives, right? Because life is difficult and throws things at us. Most of the major psychiatric disorders, as we said, happen following the onset of puberty, and they generally affect about 20% of young people. And globally, they account for 1/3 of the burden of disease, which is more than a whole bunch of really serious issues, right, that happen in different rates around the world. Unfortunately, we don't see the same comparable amount of funding provided for these things, which is, in my world, problematic, because I like to see people doing better and being healthier. So fundamentally, what we want to talk about is that we want to see people working together. It's a coordinated effort, right? Because if we don't work together, kids don't get what they need. That idea that it takes a village to raise a child. As a teacher, these are some of the things that you have to offer. And I think, I bow to you, your work is wonderful and exciting and hard. I've loved doing school-based promotion and prevention work, but I also skipped my way out of classroom at the end of the day because I didn't have to try to figure out how to teach these kids day in, day out for how many days of the week, manage behavior, support, be inspiring, all those great things that you do. So, but the thing about this is mental health promotion isn't an extra piece, it's a part of. It's an integrated way of being in the classroom. And I can tell you that when I watch teachers integrate these things, their classrooms run more smoothly because they're already managing some of the things that might need tweaking just by modeling, by the culture that they create in the classroom, by the culture that's created in a school. So it's not asking you to do a bunch of add-ons, and you're going to find your own way to do this or not do this, right? You're going to find your own ways. It doesn't look the same across the board. Every teacher has a different style and a different strength, right? But being able to identify when you see things changing and being able to use the supports that will help that kid, being able to, and not to identify in that essentializing, oh, it's so anxious kind of way. Being careful about describing what you see rather than trying to diagnose. Being a link to health services, being a liaison, being a health champion, and knowing that you're not expected to be a counselor. Nobody wants or expects you to do that. That's not your job, right? Just like I think about, I used to work in child welfare when I first started, and I have those skills, those assessment skills, but it's not my job at this age and stage to do that role. It's my job to refer to the people who are equipped to do that role, right? So making sure you're using your supports, also so that you can do better, so that you're mentally healthy as well, right? Again, describing versus interpreting. Everybody has a role to play in promoting positive mental well-being, and that's not just for students, but also for each other, right? Because it is busy work, you work hard, you deserve and need support as well to be able to role model and help put into practice the things that you want kids to do, okay? The thing when we're talking about looking at mental illness and when you're seeing kids showing signs of mental health problems or illness is when you're talking to people, kids will confide in you because you interface with them and you're often the trusted, key trusted adult in their life that may be inspiring them, that they may feel affinity for. We're not their friends. And we need to give clear messages about confidentiality and that we can't keep harmful behavior or activity secret. So I think that's, and kids, I will tell you time and again, I've had to do some pretty hard situations where I've had to break confidentiality because of someone's expressing suicidal intent, or they want to beat someone up, or there's harm about to happen. One of the key things was helping the kids know ahead of time what your role is and isn't, being able to tell them what you're going to do and how you're going to help them next. So if you have to disclose, 9 times out of 10, I could get the kid to come with me and tell their parents, and then link them to the doctor or the hospital or wherever they needed to be, and they would go willingly because I say, I can't keep this a secret because it's not safe for you, and I care about what happens next, so this is how I'm going to help you do this, right? So just thinking about, you don't have to be the counselor, and you can refer them, but it's like walking them down to the counselor's office versus chucking them out the door, or helping them understand what they're going to see next, right? And knowing what your policies and procedures are for identification, for referral, for those kind of things. Those are your tools in your backup as well, right? And how do you involve parents? Because we cannot do anything for kids without their families involved, right? And if their family isn't going to be a safe or effective party in it, how else or where else do they get those supports from? So I just skipped over that. We've given you some key questions you can ask to help with that kind of that identification piece. So again, going back to it's not your role to diagnose. So when in doubt, always make sure you're using, well, fundamentally always make sure you're using the resources that are equipped for that. So whether it's a school psychologist or a school counselor, whether your admin, they have a referral process with your local mental health supports and addiction supports, those kind of things. Okay. So I think that's kind of looking at mental health stigma and how we interface, how we model, how we help kids and ourselves and our colleagues understand these issues. But moving away from these issues is flipping the script to say, how do we help everybody do better so that maybe that pyramid looks a little different, right? That we aren't all always progressing towards the mental health problem, or if we do, that we bounce back quicker and are more resilient. What we know in the literature is that there are strong links between mental health and academic success, and then success later in life, right? That there is no health without mental health. And sometimes we don't think about it because the other stuff's easier. It's sometimes more tangible, right? Especially if people aren't talking about things. It's inside their heads. What does being mentally healthy mean for you? So give me some examples. What do you like? What do you look like? What do you sound like? What do people notice about you? What do you notice about you when you're feeling mentally healthy? Confident, okay, what else? Happy, okay. Positive outlook, and involved. So you stay connected socially, and that might also, you're involved in the things that normally interest you, or you're seeking out things that might interest you, so that you're engaging in your world in a different way. So we know what we're like when we're mentally healthy, and we know for adults that being mentally healthy means all of these things, right? That we're connected to community, where there's an engagement, we're having healthier relationships, we're operating more easily in our relationships, and we're coping with normal stresses of life. So that mental distress piece, we're able to roll with it. We don't always enjoy it. Sometimes we go through a little meltdown, but then we are able to pick back up and keep going and do the things that help us do better, right? In children and youth, this means we're actually helping the development of these skills, right? They're feeling good about themselves, they're having good friendships, and they're enjoying their life, right? And I know it's angsty, especially for teenagers. It gets terribly angsty sometimes. But through that, they're still being able to navigate their world, right? So what we know when we're talking about mental health, these are the sort of the three branches we're talking about. Two of the branches are under our positive functioning domains, and one of the branches is under our positive feeling domain. So when we are mentally healthy, these are some of the things that will be in play. And will be to different degrees at any given day across these, right? When we're feeling mental distress, we may have less of those things. But we will, if we're fundamentally mentally healthy and we're flourishing, we will come back to them. So the psychological well-being is the I, me, so my internal voice about myself. Do I accept myself? Most of the time, right? Do we have positive relationships? Personal growth. So do we actually seek out and challenge ourselves to do new things and to grow, right? And people have different ways of doing that. Some people will be reading a really big, intense novel, and the other person will be, I used to live in Canmore, climbing a mountain, right? So everybody's going to have different ways that they work with that. We have sense of purpose in life. We can navigate our environment and have some mastery over it. We kind of know how and where to go to have our needs met, right? And we have a certain degree of autonomy. We can feel okay doing things on our own, trying things. And that does not mean being isolated, but that we have some sense of how to do things ourselves, right? Social well-being, of course, are all the ways we're connected to others. It's how do we integrate and feel our sense of belonging? And social coherence, like do you understand kind of how it works? And does it mostly make sense to you, right? Most of the time. And then, of course, positive feeling, right? All those subjective feelings. So these are the places where the domains we're looking at when we're in a state of mental health, okay? Now, this is my favorite thing I have learned since I started this work and this job, which I started in July. It's a model based in the research around looking at people with a mental health diagnosis, so a mental illness, and people with no mental illness diagnosed, and then looking simultaneously at high mental health, so thinking about those domains I just talked about, and low mental health. And what the research actively shows is that someone who has moderate mental health and no diagnosis is doing more poorly in the functioning domains than someone who is flourishing with a mental illness. So you can have a diagnosis and be flourishing. And that's really important to me because think about it, go back to all those things that you listed, the negative, sort of that really negative list. Does that speak to any of these flourishing, the idea about we can flourish with mental illness or disorder? Not necessarily, right? I know this isn't surprising. It's not rocket science for a lot of you, or most of you, but just thinking about the fact that how our mental health is operating can always be improved regardless of where we are on the mental illness continuum, right? Whether we've been diagnosed or not, or whether we have a mental health problem. We can be flourishing if we have those functioning domains in place and if we have the supports to do that. I like this because it speaks to why stigma reduction can be problematic sometimes, in that we focus on the problem and don't look at all those healthy, important things that help people do well regardless of where they're at, right, in their health. I think for you guys to know that it's a coordinated effort, that in schools, because of the venue and what you have available to you and how you work with students, you're going to be doing way more of that mental health promotion work and prevention, and far less of the intervention is going to be happening in the schools, whereas the community, it flips on its head. Most of the intervention is happening with community service providers and less of the mental health promotion. Now, I can say we would like to see that pyramid widen at the top in the community, because we know about the gains, particularly in school-based work, that happens when we do mental health capacity building and those social and emotional learning programs. So when we look at positive mental health, some of the correlated changes is that kids actually want to be at school, so they come to school, particularly for youth, kids in their adolescent years. They're more likely to do better in school. They're more likely to do better after school when they're seeking jobs or building a career. Less likely to engage in substance use and risk-taking behaviors. All valuable. And they're also less likely to show chronic disease over time. Pretty important, because that is a big life-altering experience, right? And have you guys started talking about, have you been talking about a whole school approach or comprehensive school health approach? I think that's probably coming, yeah. Angela says yes. So that is beautiful. Your classes go better when you integrate things holistically. And I say that, witnessing it time and again, that and sometimes it's a bumpy start. Sometimes schools say, okay, this is what we're doing. And teachers are like, oh my God, it's one new thing to learn and it's so much work and I'm overwhelmed. Oh my goodness, I can't fit anything else in. But once it gets rolling, everybody does better. The kids do better, they feel better. The teachers actually feel more relaxed because the kids are doing better. And so it goes, right? And so I get excited when I hear that this is on the docket for education students, for sure. So a whole school approach is looking at having positive mental health as a part of everything that you do, how we teach resilience and coping skills, and that rules, procedures, and policy, not just day-to-day behavior by individual professionals, actually shapes a welcoming and respectful and caring environment. And that is pivotal. I think we did an overhaul on our mental health clinics in some of the communities I've worked in. Just changing, we did a survey and listened to what people found welcoming or not, and we tweaked it. And we did it later and had positive results, right? Because just by simply listening to what helped people feel able to come in and access our services more readily. Okay. So thinking about some of these questions, and you don't have to answer it out loud, but from the social and physical environment perspective, does your school do some of these things? Do people know the students' names? Do you welcome them? Is there social interaction, not just school academic interaction between staff and students? I loved it. The principal popped into a mindfulness session I was doing one time, and he really was being quite overt about his own experience of what was going on. And the kids were like, and they started talking to him about it. How's that distraction going, Mr. So-and-so? So they were teasing him about it, but it also created a different interaction. The kids felt more welcome and more able to approach him, which is good for kids across the board. If they feel they can approach, then if there are issues, they're more likely to seek help, right? So it goes back down to the spectrum for kids who maybe are struggling with mental illness or a disorder, right? Do we actually involve kids in the decisions? And that doesn't mean we listen to them and go, oh, that's nice, and then carry on with whatever we were going to do in the first place. Do we actually help them enact the changes or the ideas that they're putting forth, right? Teaching and learning. What are the opportunities? Do you train student leaders? And that doesn't mean just the straight A keeners. That's kids who maybe are having some challenges, but have a voice or have other things that they could show or put forth, right? How do we incorporate and make that inclusive across the board, right? And social emotional learning programs like the ones we talked about. Partnerships and services, those have been vital. The best parts of my career are based in the way that we worked and collaborated with multidisciplinary teams with schools and their admin and their staff and their teachers. I can't do my job well as when I was a mental health therapist and an addiction therapist if I'm not working with people. People do better when you've got a team of people around you. And that's also about thinking about how do you make policy changes together? How do you make things easier? How do you reduce suspension rates in a school, right? And so those are policy related, and they happen on the staff level, and they hopefully are happening on the district level as well, right? And so how can you, as a teacher, be engaged in some of that so that some of these concepts are flowing down to the students and to you and to everyone, right? Healthy school policy, and I think this is a big one in looking at, we don't think about policy because we're so busy doing that frontline work a lot of the time. We're trying to get courses done and get prep planning, and we're trying to get kids engaged and doing all the important, busy day-to-day work that is required of you. But this stuff has wide-reaching impact across the school and for your work as a teacher over the long haul. And they did a research study with the school that was looking at, they did a survey and they got feedback that the perception was that discipline was poor, and they had a really high rate of suspensions. I think it was like, was it 40 suspensions in a particular time frame. So there was a lot of suspensions happening at that school at that time, and the perception was that discipline was poor. So they put in a new policy that talked about what are our expectations in the school and how do we model that. So what are the expectations of the teachers, the students, and the families, and the admin? And everybody signed on to it, actually physically signed on, including the students. And then not only was it communicated, but you know darn well there were other things happening around that policy, right? That they started to change how they worked with that. They saw a drastic reduction the next time they looked at it. They had less than 10 suspensions. And bullying incident was down to 1. I don't know what their bullying incidents were before, but it was a drastic reduction because they changed about what the expectations around healthy behavior were in the school and communicated in that way rather than, if you do this, you're in trouble. So this is how we live and work in this school. This is the expectation. These will be the consequences if it doesn't go this way, right? And I know that's boring sometimes, but it's actually neat to see how it trickles down. Policy can have really big effects, and you guys have a role to play in that. And I think a lot of you somewhere in your career may find yourselves working up the chain in policy, right? So sort of to close on my long discussion here, thinking about what is your role in helping when we're thinking about sort of early identification, effective prevention and intervention. How do you collaborate? Do you have a sense of a plan if there are needs? Is there a crisis plan? How do you manage and communicate about confidentiality? How do you relate to parents? How do you develop those relationships so that you're better able to work with students? And how do you work with your staff to have a plan when kids show signs of distress and mental illness? And then thinking about how you can influence mental health, both from that intervention but also fundamentally in the health promotion zone, because that's where you have the most influence, the most time, and the most wide sweeping effect, right? To help everybody flourish no matter where they sit on that continuum. I'm excited for you guys. You have such an important job, and it can be so much fun, and it can be really like, you work really hard for it, but you have such great influence with kids, and I wish you an exciting semester ahead as you launch yourselves into your education careers.